Good evening. My name is Stephanie Torres Nieves, and I'm part of Team 7, and this is my individual oral presentation. Now, before I get into my half of the presentation, I did want to summarize a few of the key points that my teammate Chelsea Velas made on her half. Now, Apple is one of the biggest tech companies in the world and one of the most recognizable consumer brands. But they also have some challenges. Apple's been facing some serious backlash regarding their suppliers and worker abuse. Now, Apple could simply sit back and do nothing and let things fall for their own weight. But as Taco Bell and the farmers in Florida proves, that's not always a viable option. In this social media age and the fact that Apple is part of the technology industry, they could face some protesters at their door calling for a boycott of Apple products. And that's not something that Apple would want. Now, alternative two would be that suppliers, government, and Apple work together in order to improve the working conditions. Now, suppliers would modify their hours of operations, shuffle their schedules, providing more breaks, reducing the amount of hours worked in a week. Now, the government can modify the laws regarding a week of work, where in China it's very different than America. And in doing so, they would positively impact not only the productivity and the workflow, but they would also impact employee morale, employee health, and how the employee feels about themselves. This wouldn't only impact the employee at the job, but it would also improve their quality of life altogether. Now, alternative three would be for Apple to play the bad guy, and that would be to impose serious sanctions on suppliers who violate Apple Inc.'s supplier code of conduct. Now, if the supplier doesn't comply or cancel the agreements, Apple could face another challenge, and that would be to find a new supplier for the components of their parts. It could be a very expensive option, but it's something that Apple could consider. Now, imposing fines on the suppliers wouldn't exactly cost anything because Apple has their own in-house legal team, but they would have to be an expert in international law since the supplier is part of another country. Suppliers could decide not to pay and just quit producing parts or leak it, and that's a risk that Apple would have to deal with. Now, there's really no way to measure the cost of this particular alternative, but if you use the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus example and the cost of production and how many items they sold during the launch, the first quarter that iPhone 6 and iPhone 6 Plus was launched, Apple sold 66.5 million iPhones. Now, we're talking about $43.2 billion worth of revenue that if a supplier decided to pull out where they were no longer producing the screen that's vital to an iPhone 6, this could cause some serious damage to Apple's bottom line number, and some serious questions would come up with their investors and their shareholders. And I don't think that's an option that Apple would want to do. Now, the alternative that our team selected would be alternative two, which would be to deal with the government, the supplier, in order to improve the working conditions of the employee. Now, working with both the suppliers and the Chinese government would be a win-win option for everyone involved: the suppliers, the government, Apple, and the employee. The suppliers would get more happier employees, which would increase productivity, and they would be complying with Apple's code of conduct for their suppliers. The Chinese government would receive raving reviews within the international community, since they are known as a communist regime. Apple would win the hearts of all consumers, and the employee would get a better quality of life. Now, this Option 2 would require a 1-year implementation process where months 1 and 2 would be to discuss the issue with the suppliers and the government. Months 3 through 6 would work with the government and suppliers in order to get the laws enacted and better the working conditions. And months 7 through 12 would be to improve the marketing, would be to launch a marketing campaign to educate consumers of Apple's commitment to fair working conditions. Now, Apple addressing workers' condition with their suppliers really shows their devotion and commitment to improving the lives of everyone who crosses paths with Apple, whether you have an iPhone or you work indirectly or directly with them. Any questions? If not, it's been a pleasure. Thank you and have a great night.